Hi, this is Dr. Bob again, and this time I'm at Calaveras, Big Tree State Park in California, and I'm standing in front of the Empire State. This is probably the largest of the trees here in this North Grove of Calaveras, Big Tree State Park, and it gives us an opportunity to just see these massive, massive trees. But there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from these trees, things that point us to the factual account that exists in the Bible and the truthfulness of that record. So what are some of those things? Well, first off, these trees at one time were very, very common over the entire northern hemisphere. So prior to the flood, the land mass that existed had an ecosystem that featured a lot of these giant sequoia trees. That's important because now we see them only really on the western face of the Sierra Nevadas in California and up into Oregon a little bit. So there's just a few stands of these trees that were able to repopulate after the flood. How do we know that these trees did not exist prior to the flood? Well, it's interesting. Although dendrochronology is not a very exact science, because it counts on the fact that their assumption is that a tree only creates one growth ring per year, in spite of the fact that we have examples in trees where multiple growth rings can occur within a year. But in spite of that, when you look at these, even with those perhaps exaggerated dendrochronology dates, there are no trees that have been dated to much beyond 3,200 years old. So that puts them into the range of trees that then repopulated after the flood. So in spite of the fact that these trees, like all trees really, don't die of old age. They die because of infestations or because of fire or because of weather damage, lightning strikes, things like that. But they don't die as a result of old age. So these trees, the giant sequoias, are pretty unique because they really don't have much in the way of predator type enemies. We see a lot of the pine trees in Montana and in those areas being infested by beetles, but those do not infest the giant sequoias because of a number of factors. But one of the primary ones is that these trees have 2 to 3 foot thick on the bigger trees in bark. So there's this extensive bark that protects them from the traditional fires that clear undergrowth, as well as infestations from insects and things like that. In addition to that, because these trees naturally, their branches do not really extend into the lower part of the forest, they're pretty immune to the brush fires that will come through. So you don't get these canopy fires that are the real devastating fires to pine trees because the branches are so far off the ground. If the fire were to be extensive enough, then of course it can hop into the canopies of the giant sequoias, and then you have a real problem. And you would have these trees being susceptible to fire. But basically what that tells us is that these trees, because of the fact that they don't really have any predatory type enemies, they are able to survive for great periods of time. And these trees then, the earliest examples, the largest trees, then date to the stands that repopulated immediately after the flood. So these trees would have occupied great areas of the ecosystems prior to the flood. There are related trees, the metasequoias, which were thought to be extinct, but have now stands of them have been found in China, and they are a smaller tree, of course, but they are a related type of tree, and they grow in a slightly different environment than the giant sequoias. So we have with the giant sequoias, one, the fact that they really require this specific type of ecosystem. And although that ecosystem does exist in other places in the world, it's only here on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevadas that these trees repopulated after the flood. So we have a great indicator of the time frame that the flood talks about. But there's another great indicator here. There are other types of trees that are found in this forest as well, and they all then, of course, produce pine cones. The giant sequoias are unique because these cones will be produced, and they can remain in the tree for 20 years prior to being dropped. These trees, there's an interesting situation where there is a small grove of just a few trees downstream. there was a flood a number of years ago, and it transported these cones from these giant sequoias downstream. And what we see is, unlike many pine trees, where they wouldn't be as prone to being transported by water, that is a mechanism that is used by the giant sequoias to expand their range. And so it's easy enough for us to see that as the mountains rose up after the flood and the waters retreated, that there would have been then cones that could have been trapped in this rising Sierra Nevada mountain range and caused these trees to repopulate after the flood. There are other trees here, though, as I mentioned, and they do have pine cones that then are used. They are harvested by birds and squirrels and other animals, and they are transported then around, and that causes those forests to grow. So the sequoias have a unique method of propagation that really lends itself well to this kind of environment that we see now, that in post-flood you would just have these few stands of trees. Because they're not going to be transported by the typical birds or squirrels or things like that you would normally see. These cones do not open under normal situations. They'll drop, and you still see a number of pine cones that lay on the ground closed because they typically, it would be fire or something like that would cause them to open, or being transported in the water, and they become waterlogged then, and that then would cause the seed pods to germinate. Now, the other thing you see with the other types of cones that exist in this environment is we're here now, and it's into April, and those cones are already they've dropped, and most of them are closed, but we do see some from previous years that have opened. But it's interesting that those that we see in the fossil record, just like the leaves that we see where they're intact, the cones that we see in the fossil record tend to be in the closed position. So it tells us that this would have been early in the year, which is exactly what the biblical account says, so the first of Nisan. And so in the spring, the flood would have come. It's interesting then that, of course, at the end of the flood, of course, it comes again on the 17th of Nisan. They leave the ark, and so we know that again in the spring, now as these plants are moving into their germination stage and everything, that then the plants begin to repopulate the earth. So it's an amazing example with these giant sequoias of God's creation, but also of the factual evidence supporting the biblical record as a historic, accurate record. And so these are a great testimony to us that it's okay to believe, and that as we look in the world around us, we see God's hand in all these things, and we marvel at his creations. And as we say, he didn't have to make it beautiful, but he did. And so once again, Dr. Bob, Calaveras Big Trees State Park here in California, reminding you that it's okay to believe.